For decades, the public believed they understood Rob Reiner. He was the storyteller who understood human connection better than most. His films explored friendship, love, loyalty, and the quiet moments that shape who we become. To audiences, he appeared as a man deeply attuned to emotion, someone who knew how fragile relationships were and how easily they could be lost. What few people ever considered was whether that emotional intelligence translated fully into his private life. For his son, Nick Reiner, the truth was more complicated, and for years, largely ignored. Nick grew up surrounded by creativity, influence, and opportunity. From the outside, his childhood looked enviable. The kind of upbringing people imagine when they think of Hollywood families done the right way. There was stability. There was structure. There was no public chaos, no tabloid scandals, no dramatic implosions. And that, in many ways, is why no one ever asked deeper questions. Because when nothing looks broken, people assume nothing hurts. Nick would later say that his home was never loud with conflict, but it was often quiet in ways that felt unfinished. Conversations ended before they reached anything meaningful. Feelings were implied rather than expressed. Approval existed, but rarely arrived in words. It wasn't that my father didn't care, Nick explained years later. It's that caring was always competing with something else. That something else was work. Always work. Rob Reiner was not an absent father in the traditional sense. He was present in photographs, present at important events, present enough that no one would dare accuse him of neglect. But presence, Nick learned, has layers. And the deepest layer, emotional availability, was the one most often missing. As a child, Nick normalized the distance. He learned to interpret short conversations as enough. He learned not to ask too many questions, not to interrupt, not to demand attention from someone the world already demanded so much from. Over time, restraint became habit. Habit became personality. What made his eventual confession so striking was how long it took him to recognize the cost. Nick admitted that for years he believed the problem was himself, that his needs were excessive, his expectations unrealistic. After all, he was told constantly how lucky he was, how many kids would trade places with him in an instant. Gratitude became a quiet form of self-censorship. Pain felt unjustified when compared to privilege. But emotional neglect does not disappear just because it wears a polite face. As Nick grew older, the gap between admiration and intimacy became impossible to ignore. He could describe his father's career in detail, yet struggled to describe moments when he felt truly known by him. He understood Rob Reiner, the public figure, better than Rob Reiner, the man. And still, he said nothing. It wasn't until Rob himself began speaking publicly about regret, about emotional distance in marriage, about realizing too late what had slipped away, that something shifted. Nick recognized the language, the pauses, the tone. He had lived inside those silences long before his father ever named them. That recognition did not come with anger. It came with clarity. Nick's confession, when it finally arrived, was not an accusation. It was an explanation, a reframing of a narrative people thought was complete. He spoke not to dismantle his father's legacy, but to humanize it, to show that even men celebrated for understanding emotion can struggle to practice it consistently at home. The truth everyone ignored, Nick said quietly, is that you can love your family deeply and still leave them emotionally alone. That sentence lingered because it did not villainize anyone. It challenged something far more uncomfortable, the idea that good intentions are not always enough. And as people began listening, really listening, it became clear that this was not just a story about one father and one son. It was about the cost of prioritizing achievement over presence, about how silence can be mistaken for peace, and about how truths ignored for too long have a way of resurfacing when no one expects them to. When Nick finally allowed his words to surface, the reaction was not immediate outrage. It was something quieter and far more revealing. People paused, listened, and then, slowly, They began to re-examine everything Rob Reiner had said in recent years through a different lens. Suddenly, Rob's own reflections no longer sounded abstract or philosophical. They sounded personal. His admissions about emotional distance, about realizing too late what had eroded over time, felt less like introspection and more like an unfinished conversation that had been waiting decades to happen. Nick never framed his confession as a moment of reckoning. There was no confrontation, no dramatic fallout. What unsettled people was how familiar his story felt. The pattern he described, a parent consumed by purpose, convinced they were providing, unaware of what they were withholding, resonated far beyond one famous family. In private, Nick said the hardest part was not the absence itself, but how invisible it was. There were no bruises to point to, no broken home, no obvious dysfunction, just a persistent sense of emotional self-reliance learned far too early. You stop reaching out, he explained, because you don't want to be another demand. That mindset followed him into adulthood. Nick admitted he struggled with intimacy, not because he didn't value connection, but because he never learned how to ask for it without guilt. Vulnerability felt like interruption. Need felt like inconvenience. Even in close relationships, he found himself withholding parts of his inner life, assuming they were burdens best carried alone. It was only after years of reflection and distance that he recognized where that instinct had formed. What complicated matters further was Rob Reiner's genuine warmth. Nick emphasized repeatedly that his father was not cold or cruel. He was thoughtful, supportive, proud. But pride, Nick learned, is not the same as presence. Encouragement does not replace curiosity. Love expressed in principle does not always translate into love experienced. The public struggled with this nuance. Many rushed to defend Rob, insisting that no parent is perfect, that sacrifice is part of success. Nick did not disagree. What he challenged was the assumption that intention outweighs impact. You can do your best, he said, and still do damage without realizing it. As conversations around the confession grew, Rob's earlier words took on sharper meaning. When he spoke about mistaking endurance for love, about assuming stability meant security, people began to see a through line. Not a scandal, but a cycle. A man so focused on building something lasting for his family that he failed to remain emotionally inside it. Nick never claimed resolution. There was no neatly tied reconciliation to offer the audience. Instead, he described a relationship still in progress, cautious, honest, and finally unprotected by myth. He said they spoke differently now, more slowly, with fewer assumptions. The silences remained, but they were no longer unexamined. Perhaps the most powerful moment in his confession came when he addressed the public directly. People think telling the truth means tearing someone down, he said. Sometimes it's the only way to stop pretending. That sentiment unsettled Hollywood because it disrupted a comforting illusion. That success excuses absence. That provision compensates for emotional distance. That families with privilege are immune to quiet damage. Nick's story suggested otherwise. By the end of his reflection, one truth had become impossible to ignore. This was not a story about blame. It was a story about awareness arriving late, and the complicated work of what comes after. For Rob Reiner, it reframed his legacy not as diminished, but as incomplete. For Nick, it marked the moment he stopped minimizing his own experience. And for those watching, it raised an uncomfortable question they could not easily dismiss. How many relationships are quietly shaped by what was never said, until someone finally finds the courage to say it out loud? After the confession, the dynamic between Rob and Nick shifted in ways neither could have anticipated. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. There were no shouting matches, no tearful confrontations on camera. Instead, it was a quiet recalibration, a series of small, intentional moments that slowly rewrote years of unspoken assumptions. Nick began to notice how his father moved differently around him. The casual humor, once easy and unremarkable, carried a hint of awareness now, as if Rob were testing the waters of a conversation that had never fully existed. They started spending time together without agenda. Not for work, not for appearances, not for public expectation, but simply to occupy the same space. Nick described these instances as unremarkable, yet revolutionary. In one afternoon, sitting on a worn leather couch in a sunlit living room, Rob finally asked a question that had been absent for decades. "Nick, how did all of this feel for you?" The words were simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. Nick paused, realizing that for 35 years, no one had ever asked him in a context that mattered. It wasn't about what he achieved, what he attended, or how he performed. It was about how he felt, deeply, authentically, without expectation. He answered cautiously at first, hesitant. Hesitation was a muscle built over years of silence. But as the conversation unfolded, layers peeled back. Stories Nick had never shared, fears he had quietly carried, even the resentment that had never had an audience, all found their way into words. And for the first time, they were met with full attention, without judgment, without correction, without minimization. Rob listened, really listened. His nods were slow, deliberate. Sometimes he didn't respond at all, letting Nick's words land and settle, acknowledging their presence rather than rushing to fill the space. It was not apology in a dramatic sense. It was something subtler, perhaps harder to master: recognition, validation, presence. This shift was not instantaneous. Old habits die slowly, and both father and son carried decades of learned behavior into these new interactions. Silence still lingered in corners of the house, the kind that could easily have been mistaken for disinterest. But now it was different. It carried intention. The absence was no longer default. It was a pause chosen, observed, noticed. And that difference mattered. Outside the house, the world began to take notice. Media coverage that initially focused on Nick's confession turned to speculation about how this revelation would impact Rob Reiner's public image. Fans and colleagues debated whether honesty about emotional distance enhanced or diminished a legacy built on understanding human connection. But the people who mattered most, father and son, were unconcerned. Their work was not for an audience. It was the painstaking process of bridging an emotional gap that had long been assumed permanent. Nick reflected on this with a mixture of relief and lingering sorrow. Relief because decades of unacknowledged feelings were now spoken aloud. Sorrow because the realization that time cannot be rewound is unavoidable. "We are both older now," he admitted. "There are things we cannot reclaim, but we can shape how we move forward." For Rob, the revelation provided a different kind of clarity. He understood that his own struggles with presence were not unique. They were human, imperfect, often hidden, and sometimes consequential in ways that would not be immediately apparent. But acknowledging them, listening, and allowing space for repair was a form of courage rarely celebrated, especially in a world that prizes accomplishments over introspection. As father and son walked through these early stages of emotional reconnection, they discovered a surprising truth. The very distance that had once seemed insurmountable now created a framework for honesty. Without expectations of perfection, without the weight of assumed roles, they could finally communicate as equals, not simply as parent and child, but as two people navigating a relationship that had long been shaped by absence. By the time Part 3 reaches its natural close, it is clear that this is not a story about scandal, nor is it about redemption in the simplistic sense. It is a story about recognition, about presence, and about the painstaking effort required to repair a bond after years of neglect, however unintended that neglect may have been. And for those who have followed the story from the beginning, the lesson is both universal and uncomfortable. Relationships do not heal in a single conversation, but in the small, deliberate, often imperfect acts of attention that accumulate over time. As Nick's confession circulated, Hollywood remained uncharacteristically silent at first. The industry, accustomed to scandals that explode overnight, seemed to pause, unsure how to respond to something quieter yet far more unsettling. There was no headline-grabbing betrayal, no clandestine affair revealed, no fortune disputed. Just the slow, unflinching truth. Emotional absence can exist even in the lives of the seemingly fortunate. Journalists debated, critics analyzed, and fans posted threads filled with speculation. Social media buzzed with interpretations of Rob Reiner's decades-long silence in his personal life. Some framed it as negligence, while others emphasized intent, reminding everyone that Reiner's public persona had always been one of warmth, empathy, and advocacy for human connection. The contradiction fascinated people, a filmmaker celebrated for portraying relationships with nuance, whose own family life had been quietly fractured. Inside the Reiner household, none of this mattered. Rob and Nick were engaged in a subtler, more intimate kind of drama, the kind that doesn't attract cameras but shapes the very fabric of one's life. Their conversations had grown longer, sometimes uncomfortable, and often punctuated by long pauses. Words that were once withheld now landed with intention. Topics that were once taboo were now navigated with care. Regrets, disappointments, and the silent gaps left unspoken for decades. In one moment, Rob admitted something to Nick that had never been voiced in public. "I thought I was doing enough just by being present. But presence without attention is a hollow gift. I see that now." Nick listened, recognizing the humility in his father's words. It was not a dramatic apology, but an acknowledgement of what had been invisible. And in that acknowledgement, something shifted. The tension in the air, the weight of unspoken emotions began to ease. Even the friends closest to the family noticed a difference. Colleagues who had seen Nick grow up remarked on his newfound openness, his willingness to express feelings without immediate self-criticism. Rob, too, seemed lighter, less defensive, more reflective. It was as though the confession had unlocked a part of both men that had been constrained by decades of assumption, that they knew each other completely, even when they did not. Outside the household, the story took on layers of cultural resonance. Conversations emerged about the generational dynamics of Hollywood families, about how success and public image can sometimes eclipse genuine emotional connection. People began to recognize a pattern seen in countless households beyond celebrity. Parents absorbed in achievement, children learning to adapt, and the quiet costs of normalizing absence. Nick's story became a mirror for anyone who had ever felt overlooked, reminding audiences that emotional neglect is not always dramatic. It is often invisible. Yet within the Reiner family, the focus remained personal. The goal was not to rewrite public perception or generate sympathy. It was about recalibrating the relationship that mattered most. They began building rituals, dinners with uninterrupted conversation, walks in the park where phones stayed in pockets, evenings dedicated to listening without agenda. Slowly, the accumulated silences were being replaced with intentional attention, word by word, moment by moment. And then came the quiet revelation. Legacy is never only about what is created publicly, films, accolades, or wealth. Legacy is also shaped by how one is remembered privately in the hearts of those closest to you. Rob and Nick understood that now. They were rewriting their story not for Hollywood, not for fans, not for critics, but for themselves. The past could not be changed, but the present could be lived differently. By the end of Part 4, it was clear that this was a story of subtle transformation. It was about acknowledging imperfections, confronting discomfort, and embracing the painstaking, often slow work of emotional repair. Hollywood would continue to speculate, the public would continue to debate, and fans would dissect the narrative for signs of scandal. But within the Reiner home, a more profound truth had emerged. The courage to speak honestly and listen deeply, even decades late, can shift the trajectory of a relationship in ways that fame, fortune, or intention alone cannot achieve. As the days passed, Nick found himself revisiting memories he had long tucked away. Childhood moments that once seemed mundane now carried a weight he could not ignore. The sound of footsteps in the hall, the echo of laughter from rooms where he was not included, the quiet absence at bedtime conversations, all returned to him in vivid fragments. He realized how much of his emotional life had been shaped by gaps rather than interactions. It was not bitterness he felt. It was recognition. Recognition that love, even when present in principle, requires attention to thrive. He remembered the birthday parties that blurred together, the school achievements acknowledged with a nod rather than engagement, the times he had quietly wanted to talk to his father, but didn't, fearing he would be another demand in an already full world. These recollections were painful, yet necessary, a ledger of truths previously ignored, waiting to be acknowledged. Sitting across from Rob one evening, Nick spoke aloud the thoughts he had carried silently for years. "I used to think you didn't care," he admitted softly. "But I see now that you cared differently. I just needed to know it in a way I could feel." Rob's eyes reflected a mix of sadness and understanding. He nodded slowly, the weight of decades evident in the pause that followed. No grand declarations were needed. The acknowledgement itself was monumental. This moment crystallized something both men had been avoiding. That connection, once deferred, could still be nurtured, but only with deliberate effort. They began to reconstruct their bond, not as the father and son of a public legacy, but as two individuals finally meeting each other on equal emotional terms. The process was neither immediate nor perfect, but was alive, responsive, tentative, and real. Outside their home, the world continued to observe, debate, and speculate. Media outlets attempted to reduce Nick's confession to a sensational headline, but those who read closely understood its subtle power. The story was not about scandal or betrayal. It was about visibility, the courage to make invisible pain visible, and the understanding that acknowledgement, rather than judgment, could be transformative. Audiences began to relate, seeing in Nick's narrative reflections of their own relationships, their own unspoken gaps, and the quiet cost of overlooked emotional needs. Rob himself reflected deeply on the generational impact of his choices. He realized that his dedication to craft and public life had inadvertently shaped the emotional framework of his family. Films about empathy, connection, and the human experience had been his professional triumphs, yet he had underestimated the difficulty of practicing these lessons at home. He acknowledged that creating stories about understanding does not automatically guarantee understanding in one's own household. For Nick, the confession was a liberation of sorts. It allowed him to redefine the meaning of his childhood, not as something deficient, but as a context that shaped resilience and insight. He could now approach the relationship with his father without lingering assumptions or unspoken resentments. Every conversation, every shared silence, every laugh that followed an acknowledgement became an exercise in rebuilding trust and connection. The broader lesson, Nick realized, extended far beyond personal narrative. It touched on themes universal to families, particularly those navigating public life or high expectations. Visibility does not equate to presence. Achievement does not replace attention. And intention, no matter how pure, cannot substitute for active emotional engagement. These were truths that anyone, celebrity or not, could learn from, and that recognition itself could be a catalyst for change. By the end of Part 5, the story had reached a pivotal transformation. What began as a confession had evolved into a dialogue, a process of repair and reconnection that emphasized the power of acknowledgement over performance, presence over assumption, and listening over speaking. The narrative of Rob and Nick Reiner had shifted from a household shaped by absence to a family engaging in deliberate care, reflection, and understanding, a legacy now informed not only by public achievement, but by private truth. And in that quiet evolution, there was hope, the reminder that even delayed recognition, when met with honesty and attention, can begin to heal wounds that have lingered for decades. Months after Nick's initial confession, a subtle transformation had taken root in the Reiner household. It was quiet, almost imperceptible to anyone outside, yet the shift was profound. The air no longer carried the tension of unspoken words or the weight of deferred acknowledgement. Conversations now flowed with an intentional rhythm, a give and take that neither father nor son had fully experienced before. One evening, Rob and Nick sat together in the living room, a soft golden light filtering through the blinds. It was an ordinary scene, but it carried the weight of extraordinary change. For decades, silence had defined their interactions, a polite, assumed void. But now, every pause was a choice, every word an offering. They shared memories, small triumphs, regrets, and moments of unacknowledged joy. There was laughter, yes, but also an honesty that carried its own gravity. Rob reflected on the irony of his life's work. He had spent years crafting stories about connection, empathy, and understanding, narratives that touched millions of people worldwide. Yet, within his own home, he realized he had failed to translate these lessons into daily practice. "I thought success would buy me understanding," he said quietly, "but it doesn't. Presence and attention do." Nick nodded, recognizing in those words the long-standing truth he had lived. For Nick, the reconciliation was less about absolution and more about recognition. He had long understood that his father's love existed, but it had been framed in ways that were difficult to grasp. Now it was tangible, not perfect, not without flaw, but present. And in the presence, there was healing. He could speak, and his words were met with listening. He could feel, and those feelings were acknowledged. This process of repair extended beyond them. Friends and family noticed a shift in both men. Rob more reflective, less guarded, Nick more expressive, more willing to trust emotional intimacy. The slow work of acknowledging the past and rebuilding the present had begun to ripple outward, influencing not just their bond, but the way others perceived emotional connection in families shaped by public life. Meanwhile, the public continued to engage with Nick's confession and its implications. Audiences found resonance in his story, a reflection of a universal struggle between intention and impact, presence and absence. The narrative moved beyond celebrity intrigue. It became a conversation about emotional literacy, about listening and acknowledging the often invisible experiences of children, partners, and loved ones. It underscored a truth that many avoid confronting, that love without attention is incomplete, and that even the most well-intentioned parents can inadvertently leave lasting gaps. Rob, too, found a measure of peace. He understood that the path to repair was ongoing, that no single conversation could undo decades of patterns, but that consistent effort could alter trajectories. Presence, he realized, was not a static achievement, but a daily practice. Listening, he discovered, carried more weight than any public declaration or professional accomplishment. Nick and Rob began to craft new rituals, walks without distraction, meals without phones, evenings dedicated to conversation, and small gestures of attention that reinforced their commitment to one another. These moments were ordinary in form, but extraordinary in effect. They were tangible demonstrations of a lesson long learned but only recently acted upon. That emotional connection requires intention, not assumption. That acknowledgement can heal wounds once thought permanent. By the close of Part 6, the Reiners story had transformed from one defined by silence, absence, and unspoken expectations into a narrative of recognition, repair, and renewed commitment. The confession that once seemed disruptive became the catalyst for growth, reflection, and reconciliation. And for audiences witnessing the journey, the message was clear. Legacy is not measured solely in public achievements, wealth, or accolades, but in the quiet, deliberate care given to those closest to us. Even in a world obsessed with spectacle, it was the ordinary, intentional acts of listening, acknowledging, and showing up that left the most lasting imprint, a lesson Nick and Rob would carry forward together. The months following Nick's confession became a turning point not only in their private lives, but also in the way they understood themselves. The Reiner household, once defined by polite distance, was now alive with intentional engagement. Every conversation, every shared silence, was now chosen, not assumed. The invisible walls built over decades were slowly being dismantled, brick by brick, moment by moment. One afternoon, Rob and Nick sat on the back patio, a gentle winter sun casting long shadows across the garden. They spoke of films, of memories, of the ways life had surprised and challenged them. But beneath the surface, the conversation carried the weight of years, of absences that had once been invisible, of feelings deferred, of misunderstandings silently internalized. For the first time, they navigated these waters together, without fear or assumption. Rob admitted, quietly, that he had underestimated the impact of emotional absence. He had believed that providing materially, ensuring opportunities, and offering encouragement from a distance was enough. But Nick's confession made him understand that presence is more than physical proximity. It is attention, curiosity, and engagement. The act of being fully, consciously available to those who depend on you emotionally. Nick, in turn, acknowledged that understanding his father's intentions did not erase the years of unmet needs, but allowed him to reframe his perspective. He realized that love can exist in imperfect forms and that reconciliation is possible even when time has created gaps. The acknowledgement of both absence and intention became a bridge, fragile, yet steady, connecting them in ways that had previously seemed impossible. The reconciliation did not erase all tension, nor did it perfect their relationship, but it created a new rhythm, a mutual understanding that grew with every shared meal, every deliberate conversation, every small act of listening. They were learning together that repairing a bond takes sustained effort, patience, and the courage to confront discomfort rather than avoid it. Outside their private world, the story of Nick's confession and the gradual reconnection with his father sparked broader reflection. Audiences related, seeing reflections of their own familial experiences. It became a lesson in emotional literacy, a reminder that even well-intentioned parents can leave gaps in the hearts of their children, and that recognition and acknowledgement, no matter how delayed, can create meaningful change. Rob began to share his reflections publicly with newfound clarity. His previous discussions of regret, distance, and unspoken truths now carried a deeper resonance. Audiences realized that the man celebrated for his understanding of human relationships had lived a lesson of emotional complexity himself. It was not scandalous, not sensational. It was profoundly human. Nick's voice, once quiet and constrained by years of assumption, became a testament to the power of speaking truth. By articulating what had been ignored, he not only allowed himself to be heard, but he also gave voice to anyone who had silently endured emotional neglect. His courage demonstrated that acknowledgement and honesty, though uncomfortable, are necessary steps toward healing. Together, father and son began shaping a legacy that encompassed both professional achievement and emotional awareness. They realized that true legacy is measured not only by accolades or public recognition, but by the depth and quality of connections with those closest to us. Presence, intention, and acknowledgement became the pillars of their renewed relationship, lessons they hoped would resonate far beyond their household. By the close of Part 7, the story had come full circle. What began as a quiet confession evolved into a journey of reflection, recognition, and gradual reconciliation. The Reiners' narrative, once defined by absence, assumption, and silence, had transformed into one of engagement, intentional care, and understanding. The message was clear: even delayed recognition, when met with courage and attention, can heal wounds thought permanent. And in a world preoccupied with spectacle and public achievement, the quiet acts of listening, acknowledging, and showing up are what leave the most enduring impact.